Have you ever wondered what happens in those final moments before death? What secrets might be revealed when consciousness slips beyond the boundaries of the physical world? Tonight's case will challenge everything you thought you knew about life, death, and the pursuit of justice. Because sometimes the most compelling witness to a crime isn't among the living. This is the story of Elara Vance, a woman who quite literally became her own star witness from beyond the grave. And what she discovered during her journey to the other side would crack open a murder case that had stumped investigators for months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, on a cold November evening in Portland, Oregon, when a routine wellness check would uncover one of the most baffling crime scenes detectives had ever encountered. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Mrs. Patterson, Elara's elderly neighbor, hadn't seen the usual glow from Elara's kitchen window during her nightly tea ritual. It was a small detail, the kind that might seem insignificant to most people. But Mrs. Patterson had lived next door to Elara Vance for 8 years, and she knew her neighbor's habits better than most people knew their own family members. Elara was a creature of routine. Every evening at exactly 10:30, she would brew chamomile tea and settle into her reading nook by the front window. The soft, amber light from her vintage lamp would cast gentle shadows across the glass, visible from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen. It had become a comforting constant in the older woman's evening routine, a silent goodnight between neighbors who'd developed an unspoken bond over the years. That night, the window remained dark. Officer Martinez was the first to respond to the wellness check. He'd handled dozens of these calls over his 15-year career, most of them ending with embarrassed explanations about forgotten medications or early bedtimes. But as he approached the modest, craftsman-style home on Maple Street, something felt different. The house wasn't just quiet, it was eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. The front door stood slightly ajar. Martinez called for backup before stepping inside. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating what appeared to be a normal living room. Books stacked neatly on shelves, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, reading glasses folded beside a bookmark. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until the beam reached the hallway. That's where he found her. Elara Vance lay crumpled at the base of the stairs, her auburn hair fanned across the hardwood floor in a pattern that looked almost artistic in its tragic beauty. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark and congealed, suggesting she'd been there for hours. But she was breathing, barely, each shallow intake of air accompanied by a wet, rattling sound that made Martinez's stomach clench. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their voices sharp and clinical as they worked to stabilize her. Severe head trauma, they reported. Possible internal bleeding. Critical but alive. As they loaded her onto the stretcher, Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the scene, her practiced eyes already scanning for details that others might miss. Chen had built her reputation on solving the unsolvable, on finding patterns where others saw only chaos. She'd worked homicides for 12 years, and she'd learned to read crime scenes like other people read novels. But this one was different. This one whispered secrets she couldn't quite decipher. The house showed no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no damaged locks, no scattered belongings suggesting a struggle or robbery gone wrong. Elara's purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter, her wallet containing $200 in cash still neatly organized inside. Her jewelry box remained intact, valuable pieces glinting in the harsh fluorescent light of the crime scene photographer's equipment. Yet someone had clearly been inside. Someone had hurt Elara Vance badly enough to leave her for dead. The forensics team worked through the night, dusting for fingerprints, collecting hair samples, photographing every angle of the scene. They found traces of mud near the back door, suggesting someone had entered through the garden. But the mud was common Portland soil, the kind found in thousands of yards throughout the city. They discovered a few fibers that didn't match Elara's clothing, but they were generic cotton blends that could have come from anywhere. The weapon was nowhere to be found. By dawn, Chen had interviewed the neighbors, canvassed the surrounding blocks, and reviewed security footage from nearby businesses. Mrs. Patterson's testimony was solid but limited. She'd seen nothing unusual, heard no screams or sounds of struggle. The other neighbors reported the same thing. It was as if the attack had happened in complete silence, leaving behind only the broken body of a woman who'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life. At Portland General Hospital, Elara clung to life by the thinnest of threads. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, explained the severity of her injuries to the small group of family members who'd gathered in the waiting room. Massive head trauma, she said. Brain swelling. Even if she survived, the likelihood of permanent damage was significant. But Elara was a fighter. For 3 days, she remained in a medically induced coma while her brain struggled to heal. On the 4th day, as Dr. Walsh was checking her vital signs during the evening rounds, something went wrong. The monitors began screaming. Elara's heart rate spiked, then plummeted. Her blood pressure crashed. The steady rhythm of the machines that had been keeping her alive suddenly became chaotic, desperate alarms filling the intensive care unit with their urgent warnings. Code Blue. Room 314, Code Blue. The crash team descended like a storm, their movements precise and frantic as they fought to save her life. CPR compressions, defibrillator charges, medications pushed through her IV with mathematical precision. For 2 minutes and 12 seconds, the monitors showed flat lines where there should have been the reassuring peaks and valleys of life. Elara Vance was clinically dead, but her consciousness was far from silent. Later, when the medical team had successfully resuscitated her and she'd stabilized enough to speak, Elara would describe an experience that defied medical explanation. She remembered floating above her body, watching the doctors work with a strange sense of detachment. She could see everything with perfect clarity, she said. The controlled panic of the medical staff, the precise choreography of the resuscitation efforts, the way Dr. Walsh's hands shook slightly as she administered the final shock that brought Elara back to life. But that wasn't what interested Detective Chen when she finally got the call that Elara was conscious and able to speak. Chen had seen enough trauma cases to know that near-death experiences were common, often involving bright lights and feelings of peace. What people claimed to remember from those moments rarely held up to scrutiny, and it certainly didn't help solve crimes. What she didn't expect was for Elara to provide information that no living person could possibly have known. The interview took place 6 days after the attack, in Elara's hospital room with the blinds drawn against the harsh afternoon sun. Chen had postponed this conversation as long as possible, wanting to give Elara time to recover, but also hoping that her memories of the attack might crystallize with time. Too often, trauma victims' recollections were fragmented, unreliable, colored by fear and confusion. Elara looked fragile against the white hospital sheets, her head partially shaved and wrapped in bandages, her eyes still showing the telltale signs of her ordeal. But her voice was steady when she spoke, and her gaze was direct. "I know you probably think I'm crazy," she began, "but I need to tell you what I saw when I was gone." Chen had heard this opening before. She settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair and prepared to listen politely to another trauma-induced fantasy. But as Elara began to speak, Chen found herself leaning forward, her skepticism gradually giving way to something she couldn't quite name. "I wasn't in my body," Elara said. "I was above it, watching everything happen. But before that, before the medical emergency, I went back to my house. I saw what happened to me." She described, floating through her home like a ghost, observing the scene of her own attack with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an experiment. She saw herself walking down the hallway, unaware of the danger waiting in the shadows. She watched her attacker emerge from the coat closet, a figure dressed in dark clothing with something heavy in their hand. "I couldn't see their face clearly," Elara continued, her eyes distant as she accessed memories that shouldn't have existed. They kept to the shadows, moved like they knew the house well. But when they bent over me after I fell, when they were checking to see if I was still alive, their jacket rode up slightly. Chen's pen had stopped moving across her notepad. Something in Elara's tone had shifted, becoming more focused, more certain. "There was a tattoo on the back of their neck," Elara said. "Small, but distinctive. It looked like a compass rose, with intricate details around the edges. Very precise work, not something you'd get at just any shop." Chen made a note, though she wasn't sure why. Trauma victims often created false memories to fill in gaps, their minds constructing plausible scenarios from fragments of reality and imagination. But the specificity of the detail was unusual. "Is there anything else?" Chen asked. "Any other details you remember?" Elara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes closed as if she were accessing a file in some internal database. When she spoke again, her voice carried an odd quality, almost as if she were reading from a script. "After they left, I followed them," she said. "Not physically, of course, but somehow I was able to see where they went. They walked through my backyard to the old storm drain behind the fence. There's a maintenance access panel there covered by ivy. They opened it and threw something inside." Chen felt a chill run down her spine. The storm drain system behind Elara's house had been searched, but only the main channels. The maintenance access panels were numerous and difficult to locate, hidden by years of overgrowth. "What did they throw away?" Chen asked. "Something metal," Elara replied. "It made a hollow sound when it hit the bottom of the shaft. And there was something else, something that seemed important, though I'm not sure why. Their phone kept making this sound, like wind chimes, very soft and musical. It wasn't a normal ringtone." As Chen left the hospital that afternoon, she found herself in an unusual position experience told her suggest. Everything her training and that Elara's story was impossible. People didn't float above their bodies and observe crimes. They didn't follow their attackers through out-of-body surveillance missions. They certainly didn't provide accurate details about evidence disposal from beyond the veil of clinical death. But two things nagged at her as she drove back to the precinct. First, Elara's description of the attack matched the physical evidence perfectly. The location where she said she fell, the angle of impact, even the approximate time based on the blood coagulation patterns. Details that hadn't been released to the public or discussed in Elara's presence. Second, and more troubling, was the certainty in Elara's voice when she described the tattoo and the storm drain. It wasn't the hesitant, reconstructive quality of recovered memory. It was the confident recitation of observed fact. That evening, Chen found herself standing behind Elara's house with a flashlight and a growing sense of unease. The storm drain system was exactly as described. A network of concrete channels and maintenance shafts that most people wouldn't even know existed. She located the access panel that Elara had mentioned, hidden behind a curtain of ivy that looked undisturbed but showed subtle signs of recent contact when examined closely. The panel was locked, but Chen had come prepared. As the metal cover swung open with a rusty groan, her flashlight beam penetrated the darkness below. The shaft was about 8 feet deep, lined with concrete and filled with the detritus of decades. Leaves, trash, and standing water created a miniature ecosystem of urban decay. And there, partially submerged in the murky water at the bottom, was something that made Chen's breath catch in her throat. A crowbar. Heavy, metal, with what looked like dried blood on one end. The weapon that had nearly killed Elara Vance, hidden exactly where a dead woman claimed to have watched her attacker dispose of it. As Chen called for a forensics team, she found herself facing a question that would haunt the remainder of the investigation. Either she was dealing with the most elaborate hoax she'd ever encountered, or Elara Vance had done something that science said was impossible. She had witnessed her own attempted murder from beyond the boundaries of life itself. The forensics team arrived within the hour, their equipment cases splashing through puddles as they descended into the storm drain like urban archaeologists excavating secrets from the city's underground veins. Chen watched from above as they photographed the crowbar from every conceivable angle, the camera flashes creating stark shadows against the concrete walls. Dr. Martinez, the lead forensic analyst, emerged with the weapon sealed in an evidence bag, water still dripping from its surface. Preliminary examination shows what appears to be dried blood consistent with the victim's injuries, he reported, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to jump to conclusions. We'll need 48 hours for complete analysis, but the weight and dimensions match the wound patterns perfectly. Chen nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, spinning through possibilities that made less sense with each passing moment. How could a woman in a coma, her brain swollen from trauma, have known about this location? The access panel wasn't visible from any window in Elara's house. Most longtime residents didn't even know the maintenance shafts existed, hidden as they were beneath decades of vegetation and urban neglect. Back at the precinct, Chen spread the case files across her desk like tarot cards, searching for patterns that might explain the impossible. Elara Vance had lived a remarkably unremarkable life. She worked as a librarian at the downtown branch, kept a small garden, volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. Her social circle was limited but stable, her routines predictable, her conflicts minimal. The attack made no sense from any traditional investigative angle. Nothing had been stolen, no enemies had emerged from background checks, no recent changes in her life suggested she'd attracted the wrong kind of attention. It was the kind of random violence that made seasoned detectives lose sleep, the kind that suggested either a stranger with unknowable motives or someone very close with very hidden reasons. Chen's phone rang, interrupting her brooding. Dr. Walsh's voice carried a note of professional confusion that immediately put Chen on alert. "Detective, I need to discuss something unusual about Ms. Vance's case," the neurosurgeon said. "Could you come to the hospital? There are some aspects of her recovery that we need to address." 20 minutes later, Chen found herself back in the sterile corridors of Portland General, following Dr. Walsh to a small consultation room away from the bustle of the ICU. The doctor's expression was troubled, the kind of look medical professionals wore when their training collided with something that didn't fit neatly into established categories. "I've been practicing neurosurgery for 18 years, Dr. Walsh began, settling into her chair with the careful precision of someone choosing her words deliberately. "I've treated hundreds of traumatic brain injuries, and I've seen my share of patients who claim unusual experiences during cardiac events. But Elara's case is different." She pulled up Elara's brain scans on her computer, the ghostly gray images revealing the intricate architecture of human consciousness. The damage she sustained should have resulted in significant memory impairment, particularly for events immediately preceding the trauma. The areas responsible for forming new memories were severely compromised. By all medical logic, she shouldn't remember anything from the hours before the attack, let alone possess the kind of detailed recall she's demonstrating. Chen studied the scans, trying to make sense of the bright spots and dark areas that Dr. Walsh pointed out. "But she does remember. In fact, her memories seem more vivid than most trauma victims I've interviewed. Exactly. And there's something else. Dr. Walsh pulled up another set of images, these showing brain activity patterns during Elara's cardiac arrest. During the 2 minutes she was clinically dead, we maintained monitoring of her brain function. Typically, we see a rapid cessation of electrical activity within seconds of cardiac arrest. But look at this. The images showed something that made Chen's skepticism waver. Instead of the expected flat lines, the scans revealed unusual patterns of activity, particularly in regions associated with visual processing and memory formation. It wasn't the chaotic firing of a dying brain, but something more organized, almost purposeful. I can't explain it medically, Dr. Walsh admitted. The patterns suggest she was processing complex visual information during a time when her brain shouldn't have been capable of any higher function at all. It's unprecedented in my experience. That evening, Chen found herself breaking one of her cardinal rules. She called her retired mentor, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, the man who'd taught her that good detective work was built on evidence, not intuition. Morrison had solved more cold cases than anyone in the department's history, and he'd done it by following facts wherever they led, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. "Frank, I need to run something by you that's going to sound crazy," she began, settling into her home office with a glass of wine, and the growing certainty that this case was going to change her understanding of what was possible. Morrison listened without interruption as she laid out the entire scenario, the impossible knowledge, the hidden weapon, the medical anomalies, the complete lack of conventional leads. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "In 40 years of police work," Morrison finally said, "I learned that the universe occasionally hands you gifts wrapped in packages you don't recognize. The question isn't whether Elara's experience fits our understanding of how things work. The question is whether the information she provided is actionable." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've got a weapon that was hidden in a location only the perpetrator should have known about. You've got specific details about a distinctive tattoo. Those are solid investigative leads, regardless of their source. Stop worrying about how she knew and start figuring out who she saw." Morrison was right, of course. Chen had been so focused on the impossible nature of Elara's testimony that she'd nearly forgotten the basic principle of detective work. Follow the evidence, no matter how strange its origin. The next morning brought a breakthrough that would validate Morrison's pragmatic approach. The blood analysis on the crowbar came back as a perfect match for Elara's DNA, confirming it as the weapon used in the attack. More importantly, the forensics team had discovered something else. A partial fingerprint preserved in the dried blood, smudged but potentially viable for comparison. Chen also received a call from Officer Rodriguez in the gang unit, responding to her inquiry about distinctive tattoos. "I've been working the streets for 8 years, Rodriguez said, "and I've never seen a compass rose tattoo like the one you described, but I know someone who might have. There's a shop called Sacred Skin on Hawthorne Boulevard. The owner, Tommy Nakamura, specializes in nautical and maritime designs. If anyone's done that specific work in Portland, it would be him." Sacred Skin occupied a narrow storefront between a vintage clothing shop and a coffee roastery, its windows filled with examples of Nakamura's intricate artwork. The man himself was in his 50s, heavily tattooed, with the careful eyes of someone who'd learned to read people before permanently marking their skin. A compass rose on the back of the neck, he mused, when Chen showed him Elara's detailed description. That's very specific placement. Most people want larger pieces there, something that makes a statement. A small, detailed compass rose suggests someone with maritime connections, maybe military or commercial fishing background. He disappeared into his office and returned with a thick portfolio of photographs. years of his work documented in careful detail. "I keep records of everything," he explained. "Partly for liability, partly because I'm proud of the craft. If I did that piece, it'll be in here." They spent 20 minutes flipping through images of dragons and roses, memorial pieces and abstract designs, the accumulated artwork of thousands of customers seeking to transform their bodies into canvases of personal meaning. Then Nakamura stopped, his finger tapping against a photograph that made Chen's pulse quicken. "There," he said. "3 months ago. Small compass rose, very detailed work, positioned precisely at the base of the neck below the hairline. Customer specifically requested it be small enough to hide under a collar. The photograph showed exactly what Elara had described. An intricate compass rose no larger than a silver dollar, its directional points decorated with nautical flourishes that spoke of genuine craftsmanship. But it was the name written beneath the photo that made Chen's breath catch in her throat. Marcus Holloway, age 32, address listed as 847 Cedar Street, Portland, Oregon. Chen knew that address. It was 6 blocks from Elara's house, close enough to walk through the interconnected backyards and storm drain systems that crisscross the neighborhood like hidden highways known only to children and criminals. "Do you remember anything else about this customer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. Nakamura nodded slowly, accessing memories with the same precision he applied to his artwork. "Quiet guy, polite but nervous. Said he'd recently moved back to Portland after years working on fishing boats in Alaska. Paid in cash, seemed familiar with the neighborhood. Oh, and one other thing that stood out." "What's that?" His phone kept making this sound while I was working. Not a normal ringtone, more like wind chimes or something musical. Every few minutes, very soft but distinctive. I remember thinking it was an unusual choice for a guy who looked so serious. The pieces were falling into place with the satisfying precision of a lock being opened by the correct key. Chen had learned to trust these moments when seemingly random elements suddenly revealed their connections, when chaos resolved into pattern and pattern pointed toward truth. Back at the precinct, she ran Marcus Holloway through every database available to Portland PD. His record was clean except for a few minor infractions. A DUI from 5 years ago, a noise complaint from his current address, a civil dispute with a former landlord that had been settled out of court. Nothing that suggested violent tendencies, but nothing that ruled them out either. His employment history showed exactly what Nakamura had described. 3 years working on commercial fishing vessels out of Anchorage, followed by a recent return to Portland and a job at a marine supply warehouse near the docks. Single, no dependents, no obvious connection to Elara Vance. But Chen had learned that the most dangerous connections were often the ones that didn't appear in official records. She began mapping out the geography of both their lives, looking for intersection points that might explain why Marcus Holloway would want to hurt a librarian he'd never officially met. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor whose vigilance had led to Elara's discovery. When Chen returned to interview her more thoroughly, she mentioned something that hadn't seemed important during their first conversation. "About 6 weeks ago," Mrs. Patterson said, settling into her kitchen chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered better days, "there was a young man doing yard work for several houses in the neighborhood. Nothing formal, just going door to door offering to clean gutters, trim hedges, that sort of thing. Elara hired him to clear out her storm drains after that big storm in September." Chen felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when seemingly unrelated facts suddenly revealed their significance. "Do you remember what he looked like? Not very tall, maybe average build. Dark hair, kept to himself mostly. He worked on Elara's place for 2 days, spent a lot of time in her backyard dealing with all those drainage issues she'd been having. Seemed to know what he was doing. Did you ever see them talking? Did they seem friendly? Mrs. Patterson considered this carefully, her eyes distant as she accessed memories that might hold the key to everything. Now that you mention it, yes. On the second day, I saw them on her back porch sharing a cup of coffee. They were talking for quite a while, seemed comfortable with each other. Elara was laughing at something he said. The picture was becoming clearer, taking on the sharp focus that Chen associated with cases about to break wide open. Marcus Holloway had spent 2 days at Elara's house, learning the layout, discovering the location of hidden storm drains, building enough of a relationship that she might have felt comfortable letting him inside weeks later. But what had transformed a casual acquaintance into attempted murder? That was the question that would require more than surveillance and database searches to answer. Chen decided it was time to pay Marcus Holloway a visit. The address on Cedar Street led to a narrow duplex that had seen better decades, its paint faded and its small front yard surrendering to the inevitable entropy of urban decay. Chen parked across the street and observed the building for several minutes, noting the drawn curtains, the lack of obvious activity, the general air of a place where someone lived but didn't truly inhabit. She was about to approach the front door when movement in the side yard caught her attention. A man emerged from behind the building, carrying what appeared to be a garbage bag toward the curb. Even from a distance, Chen could see the distinctive tattoo at the base of his neck, exactly where Elara had described it, exactly as it appeared in Nakamura's photograph. Marcus Holloway looked older than his 32 years, with the weathered skin of someone who'd spent significant time outdoors, and the cautious movements of someone who'd learned to be aware of his surroundings. He was placing the garbage bag in a metal can when he noticed Chen's unmarked police car, his body language shifting immediately from casual to alert. Chen had 2 choices: approach him directly and risk him fleeing or destroying evidence, or maintain surveillance and build a stronger case before making contact. Her instincts, honed by years of reading human behavior under stress, suggested that Marcus Holloway was a man carrying secrets he desperately wanted to keep buried. She chose surveillance. For the next 6 hours, Chen watched as Holloway followed a routine that spoke of careful planning and growing paranoia. He left his duplex twice, both times taking circuitous routes that seemed designed to identify anyone who might be following him. He visited a hardware store where security cameras would later show him purchasing bleach, rubber gloves, and heavy-duty garbage bags. He stopped at an electronics store and bought a new cell phone, paying in cash. Most tellingly, he drove to a remote section of Forest Park and spent 40 minutes in an area not visible from any road, returning to his car with empty hands and muddy shoes. Chen called for backup. The arrest happened at dawn the next day, when Marcus Holloway stepped out of his duplex to retrieve the morning newspaper and found 6 Portland police officers surrounding his property. He didn't run, didn't resist, didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply stood in his doorway with the resignation of someone who'd been expecting this moment for days. "Marcus Holloway," Chen said, showing her badge, "you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Elara Vance." As they cuffed him and read him his rights, Chen noticed something that made her certainty complete: the soft sound of wind chimes coming from his pocket, exactly as Elara had described from her impossible vantage point beyond life itself. The confession came 12 hours later, after Holloway had been processed, booked, and left alone with his thoughts in an interview room designed to encourage honesty through its stark discomfort. Chen had seen this progression before, the initial defiance giving way to resignation, then to a kind of relief that the secret was finally too heavy to carry alone. "I never meant for it to go that far," he said, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who'd replayed the same scene in his mind hundreds of times. It was supposed to be simple. Get in, get what I needed, get out. She wasn't supposed to be there. The story that emerged was both mundane and tragic. The kind of desperate decision that transforms ordinary people into criminals through a combination of circumstances and poor judgment. Holloway had been struggling financially since returning from Alaska, his savings depleted by months of unemployment, and his mother's mounting medical bills. When he'd worked at Elara's house, he'd noticed details that suggested she had money. Expensive books, quality furnishings, a safe that was visible from certain angles in her home office. "I thought she'd be at work," he continued, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "I knew her schedule from when I was doing the yard work. She always left at 8:30, didn't come home until 6. But that day was different. She was sick, stayed home from the library." He'd entered through the back door, using knowledge he'd gained during his legitimate work at the property. But Elara had heard him in the kitchen, had come downstairs to investigate. In the panic of the moment, faced with the collapse of his plan and the certainty of arrest, Holloway had grabbed the first weapon he could find. "She recognized me," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Called me by name, asked what I was doing. I couldn't think straight. Everything went wrong so fast. The attack had been brutal but brief. One swing of the crowbar, aimed at her head to stop her from screaming. But the force had been too great, the injury too severe. Faced with what he'd done, Holloway had panicked completely, disposing of the weapon and fleeing through the storm drain system he'd helped maintain weeks earlier. "I've been waiting for you to find me," he admitted, every day expecting the knock on the door. "When she survived, when I heard she was awake and talking, I knew it was over. She could identify me." What Holloway didn't know, what Chen chose not to tell him during the interview, was that Elara had never seen his face during the attack. The lighting in her hallway hadn't been sufficient, and her injuries had occurred too quickly for her to process visual details in any conventional sense. The only way she could have known about his tattoo, his disposal of the weapon, his distinctive ringtone, was exactly as she'd described it, by observing the crime from a vantage point that medical science insisted was impossible. The trial of Marcus Holloway began 6 months later, in a downtown Portland courthouse that had witnessed decades of human drama played out under the harsh fluorescent lights of justice. The media attention was intense but respectful, drawn not by the violence of the crime, but by the impossible circumstances of its solution. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez had built her career on airtight cases, on evidence that could be quantified, measured, and presented to juries without requiring leaps of faith. But as she prepared her opening statement, she found herself facing a challenge unlike any in her 15-year career. How do you present testimony from a witness who was clinically dead when she observed the crucial evidence? "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martinez began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who'd learned to make the extraordinary seem inevitable. "This case will challenge your preconceptions about what's possible. But I ask you to focus not on the mystery of how the evidence was discovered, but on the evidence itself." The prosecution's case was methodical, building layer upon layer of physical proof that painted Marcus Holloway as the only person who could have committed the crime. The fingerprint on the crowbar, the blood evidence, the timeline that placed him in the neighborhood at the crucial moment. The tattoo that matched Elara's description with photographic precision. The cell phone with its distinctive wind chime ringtone, still in his possession when he was arrested. But it was Elara's testimony that transformed the courtroom into something approaching a cathedral of disbelief. She took the stand on the third day of the trial, walking slowly but steadily to the witness box, her auburn hair now showing silver streaks that hadn't been there before the attack. The injuries had healed, but they'd left their mark in ways that went beyond the physical. "Miss Vance," Martinez said gently, "I want you to tell the jury about your experience on November 15th, specifically about what you observed during your cardiac arrest." Defense attorney James Crawford had already objected multiple times to this line of testimony, arguing that near-death experiences were not admissible evidence, that they represented nothing more than the brain's response to trauma and oxygen deprivation. But Judge Patricia Hawkins had ruled that Elara's observations, regardless of their source, had led to the discovery of physical evidence that was undeniably real. "I know how this sounds," Elara began, her voice steady but soft, requiring the packed courtroom to lean forward to hear her words. "I know it challenges everything we think we understand about consciousness and death. But I'm going to tell you exactly what I experienced and let you decide what it means." She described floating above the medical team as they worked to save her life, watching with a strange sense of detachment as Dr. Walsh administered the shocks that would eventually bring her back. But then her testimony took a turn that made even the court reporter pause in her transcription. "I found myself back in my house," Elara continued, "but not as I'd left it. I was watching the night of the attack, seeing it unfold like a movie I'd somehow missed the first time. I saw myself walking down the hallway, unaware of what was waiting." The courtroom was absolutely silent as she described watching her own attack from an impossible vantage point, seeing details that her conscious mind had never processed. The way Holloway had emerged from the coat closet where he'd been hiding. The panic in his movements when she'd recognized him. The desperate swing of the crowbar that had nearly ended her life. "When I saw the tattoo," she said, her gaze moving to the defendant's table where Holloway sat with his head bowed, "I knew it was important. It was small, intricate, positioned exactly at the base of his neck where a collar would normally hide it. During the attack, when he leaned over to check if I was still breathing, his jacket pulled up slightly, and I could see it clearly." Crawford's cross-examination was aggressive but careful, walking the line between skepticism and respect for a woman who'd survived a brutal attack. He pressed Elara on the impossibility of her claims, on the lack of scientific evidence for consciousness existing outside the body, on the trauma-induced nature of her memories. "Miss Vance," he said, pacing before the witness stand with the controlled energy of a predator circling prey, "isn't it possible that your mind constructed these detailed memories from fragments of information you'd absorbed unconsciously? Details you might have noticed about Mr. Holloway during his work at your property?" "I watched him hide the weapon," Elara replied, her voice unwavering despite the intensity of Crawford's questioning. I followed him through my backyard to the storm drain access panel. I saw him open it, heard the metal hit the concrete at the bottom. I couldn't have known about that location from any conscious memory because I'd never been back there during his work at my house." Crawford pressed harder, but Elara's testimony remained consistent, detailed, unshakable. When the jury returned after 3 hours of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. As Marcus Holloway was led away in shackles, Detective Chen found herself standing in the courthouse hallway, staring at the case file that had consumed 6 months of her life. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, every witness statement documented, every forensic detail preserved for posterity. But nowhere in those official records would future investigators find an explanation for how the case was actually solved. Dr. Walsh published a paper in the Journal of Near-Death Studies 6 months later, documenting the unprecedented brain activity patterns she'd recorded during Elara's cardiac arrest. The medical community responded with the usual mixture of fascination and skepticism, offering theories that ranged from quantum consciousness to elaborate neural misfiring. but no one could explain how a dying brain had processed visual information from locations miles away from the hospital bed where Elara's body lay fighting for life. Elara herself returned to work at the library, though she requested a transfer to the research department, away from the public interactions that had once brought her joy. The experience had changed her in ways that went beyond the physical scars, leaving her with a quiet certainty about the nature of consciousness that she rarely discussed with anyone. She'd touched something beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence, and that knowledge was both a gift and a burden she carried alone. 3 years later, on the anniversary of her attack, Elara received an unexpected letter. It was from Marcus Holloway, written from his cell in the Oregon State Penitentiary. The letter was brief, consisting of only 3 sentences that would haunt her for the rest of her life. I dream about that night every night. In my dreams, you're there, watching me, just like you said. How did you see me when you were already gone? Tonight, as you lie in your bed processing this impossible story, ask yourself this question. In those final moments when consciousness slips away from the physical world, what secrets might be revealed? What truths become visible when the constraints of flesh and bone no longer limit our perception? Because if Elara Vance could witness her own attempted murder from beyond the threshold of death, what else might be waiting in that space between heartbeats, in that silence between breaths, in that darkness between one world and the next? The case of Elara Vance remains the only instance in recorded legal history where testimony from a clinically dead witness led to a murder conviction. Whether you believe it represents proof of consciousness beyond death or simply the most extraordinary coincidence in criminal justice, one thing remains undeniable. Sometimes the truth is stranger than any fiction we dare to imagine. Sweet dreams.